Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to present the 1915 production, The Cheat, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. This film is considered one of the high watermarks of the early feature film industry in America. It offers underplayed acting, although it's a melodrama, and it has extraordinarily subtle lighting and very, very smooth cutting. Indeed, this is a picture that looks a lot like something very good made today in a whole set of ways. But it's also a film deeply connected with its moment and with American culture. To discuss that and much more, we have with us Sumiko Higashi. She is the author of Cecil B. DeMille and American Culture, The Silent Era, the definitive study of this. So now, take this opportunity to journey back to 1915 in Cecil B. DeMille's The Cheat. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see one of the most distinguished films of its era, 1915, in American film history. It's a very rich film from a very rich career, that of Cecil B. DeMille. And it's a pleasure to have with us today for the next 30 minutes to discuss that Sumiko Higashi. Sumiko is the author of Cecil B. DeMille and American Culture, The Silent Era. I have to say, Sumiko, it's a terrific book that's really helped me understand DeMille's place in American culture and in American film history. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So let's go back to 1915. In a lot of ways, it's a very long time ago, but it's a very important moment in the development of the American feature film. Who's Cecil B. DeMille at this time, and what kind of role is he playing? What's he doing?
Well, DeMille actually is one of the more interesting pioneers of the American film industry. He's been quite overshadowed by D.W. Griffith. But if you look at the early trade journals that report the development of the film industry in those years, DeMille was equally, if not more important over time, because it seems to me that Griffith's films become dated, whereas DeMille captures the essence of the consumer culture that is developing during this period, albeit in the pre-war period, we're talking about consumer culture for the well-to-do.
Right, to be sure. So he's someone who begins. He comes from a theatrical family. How does he get involved in film, and how long has he been in film by 1915?
Well, he comes from a very famous playwriting family. His father was Henry Churchill DeMille, and his brother William DeMille were both very successful playwrights for the stage. His mother ran a theatrical agency. So he had been well exposed to the theatrical life, which he transposed into film. That was really one of his major contributions. A number of directors did that, but DeMille capitalized on his legacy, and he was able to establish with Jesse Lasky the Jesse L. Lasky Feature Play Company, which was formed, interestingly enough, with then Samuel Goldfish, who later became Samuel Goldwyn, and Arthur Friend, who's not as well known. And when that company merged with Zucker's Famous Players, it became a major studio in the early silent period and eventuated in what was at the time a distributor, but it became Paramount Studios. So DeMille was a very important pioneer, not just in the filmmaking process, but in building the studio system that became Hollywood.
Okay, I think that's very important to recognize, because for many people, the image of DeMille is only the image of the older DeMille, and by that I mean even post-World War II, the man who shows up in Sunset Boulevard for a brief appearance, the person who is behind his last film, The Ten Commandments. He's associated with all of that, and he's a very different character if you look at his entire career. If you look back at how important he is, 35 or 40 years before that, and the role that he's playing.
Well, I think that DeMille was a very interesting and artistic, very innovative filmmaker in the early period. He starts to ossify as a filmmaker, I would say, right around 1922, in the early 20s. And then, of course, he contributed to his own reputation as a showman by constructing those bathtub and biblical and historical epics for which he's so well known today. But those films, it seems to me, are rooted in the 19th century still. They are constructed as a series of tableaux.
Right.
And they're very painterly. The compositions really in the color, not the color, but the sound Ten Commandments, some of them are quite striking. But the films are sort of rooted in a 19th century aesthetic that I don't think he ever transcended. It's interesting how his career, in my mind, goes downhill from the early 20s, so that those achievements have obscured the very innovative, very creative, very dynamic part of his artistic life in the early part of the film industry, when it seems to me he was very instrumental in establishing the concept of the auteur. DeMille was nothing if not bent on establishing himself in the film industry because he had so labored under the shadow of his father and his brother in stagecraft. So he tried very hard to excel as a filmmaker, but in these early years, he was really, he had to struggle with the fact that he was working with players who were so much better known than he was. Geraldine Farrar, for instance, the Metropolitan Opera soprano who starred in a half dozen films for him, was so much better known than he was. But in doing so, in working with these opera stars, these stage stars that he brought out, Wilfred Buckland, the art director whom he brought out from New York and so forth, he managed to achieve a couple of very important things. He established himself as a very important and rising film director. And he also helped to legitimate film, which really has a reputation at this time as being lower working class immigrant entertainment. And although scholars today still debate a great deal whether film was intended initially for a middle class audience or a working class audience, it's fairly clear to me that in terms of mass spectatorship, it was working class entertainment, and that to construct film now in terms of a feature that is intertextually related to stage and opera and so forth, the more so-called highbrow art forms, that DeMille is extremely instrumental in helping to legitimate this art form and in establishing himself also as a rival to D.W. Griffith, a fact that was very widely recognized in trade journals at the time. Although, as I said, his rather stilted tableau-like sound productions are unfortunately what he's mostly known for today, and they've obscured the really dynamic period of his early career, which to me is the most interesting, which is why my book is labeled The Silent Era.
Well, let's talk about, you've been talking about his intertextual relations. We've introduced a couple of themes here that I think that are well worth developing further. One of the things that you're so interested in is the relationship between a whole set of American cultural forms and discourses and the development of cinema. That cinema for you is not something that can be separated from all these other activities. So let's talk to us a little bit about the emergence of a new kind of consumer culture in the beginning of the 20th century, and how that relates to Griffith and his, for example, his portrayal of women.
Well, I think that DeMille was quite brilliant in representing this transitional moment in our history, which in my mind is one of the really astounding transformations that takes place early in the 20th century, because we're still consumers. We're still caught up in consumerism. And in point of fact, Americans were not taught to become consumers initially. A penny saved is a penny earned, etc. All right. Americans, in terms of their character, and Warren Sussman has a very interesting essay on this, in terms of their character, were taught to be restrained, full of self-denial, and more or less mastering their impulses. In consumer culture, you are invited to become really addicted to pleasure. And I think that this is where Orientalism, which is a Western discourse about the Far East, this is where Orientalism becomes important, because the Orient, dating back to the early China trade, is associated with luxury goods.
Oh, okay.
And in the American mind, with seduction, with deviant sexuality, with pleasure, etc. And we're talking both now about the Middle East and the Far East. All right, so that in this film, it's no accident that Sessho Hayakawa is a merchant, and that his mansion really is a set design that resembles department store displays. All right, and he tries to seduce the so-called heroine with objects, with goods, with displays that are particularly seductive for her. So that what you're seeing at this point in time among the upper middle class, especially women, and their consumption patterns were often thought to be quite irrational and gender specific, right? You're seeing the intersection of Orientalist fantasies and a redefinition of women's role in terms of less privatization in the domestic household, more coursing around the so-called fabulous ladies' mile, and spending time and money in department stores, being seduced by goods, in fact, becoming addicted to purchasing. So that there's this pattern of defining yourself in terms of goods and in terms of the performance, the social performance that you're now going to embark upon as a personality once you have acquired all this material wealth. It's an interesting moment in the transition of American history and culture, what Warren Sussman calls a change from scarcity to abundance, the transition from defining people in terms of character as opposed to being personality. So then, of course, you have a great deal of social coding, deception, emphasis on appearances, and this is what we have today. I mean, our whole politics, our whole political system today has become one of image. That is, the dominance of visuality and image making becomes very important at this time, and it's so much a predictor of where we are going.
Well, this is very interesting to me because one of the questions I think that a work like this poses is, to what degree, I think everyone would agree that DeMille is very good at embodying this in this film. To what degree do you think he offers a critique of this change, and where does that critique come from? Or he's just more interested in somehow incorporating all of this in the work?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure that there is very much of a critique in his work about consumption. In fact, I think that, and I've made this point in my book, that filmmaking itself is a form of consumption. I mean, you have costumes, sets, legions of extras, the more the merrier, the bigger the better. And DeMille himself became addicted to that as a form of filmmaking, and quite formulaic filmmaking at that. And it seems to me that in his films, he became so intent on demonstrating the luxuries, the goods, the pleasure of consumption, that he in fact spurred people, and this is well documented in the literature of the time. He really spurred consumption a great deal, especially in the post-war period. Yeah. All of the costumes that were shown in his films, you know, he made these wonderful films, that trilogy, Why Change Your Wife, you know, Don't Change Your Husband, Old Wives for New. And then there's a fourth film that's tacked on, The Affairs of Anatole. That's a wonderful series of films in which consumption becomes center stage. And unlike The Cheat, there's no guilt about consumption, all right? The guilt, the Protestant guilt has disappeared. And in point of fact, what you have is you have a secular religion arising. That is, you now invest goods with a great deal of symbolic and even spiritual value in terms of defining yourself and your mission in life. And so it seems to me that DeMille was very instrumental in accomplishing, in helping to achieve this transformation in American culture and society. And so from that perspective, you can't diminish his importance. You might criticize him for the result, because it seems to me that the relationship between the celebrity culture, consumption, materialism, defining yourself in terms of goods, performance, etc., all of that is represented in DeMille's films, and we're still caught up in it today. It's become much more pervasive today, so that it's not just middle-class women like the heroine in The Cheat. Everyone's caught up in it.
Well, let's stick with the protagonist, the female protagonist of The Cheat, because you talked a little bit earlier about all the ways in which DeMille uses, you know, the images as well as the discourses that surround him. Fanny Ward is who plays the lead role. Is not, I think, so well known now, though she was an enormously famous person in her own era, and the casting of her is a very interesting thing in this film. Could you tell us a little bit about who she was and why he would have selected her for this role? Because I think that feeds into exactly this notion of luxury and consumer culture and definition of person through the acquisition of objects.
Well, she was a stage actress, and in point of fact, her acting style and the acting style of Jack Dean are rather different from Hayakawa's acting style. They're much more theatrical, and their gestures are broader in front of the camera. She was a subject of a lot of literature about her possessions, her, you know, all the people, the servants who worked in her, the people who were on her staff. There was a lot of publicity about her consumption, etc. And so she didn't have to really play anybody but herself in this film. But at this point in time, DeMille is still ambivalent enough about this woman's consumption to cast her in a moral dilemma. Mm-hmm. Of course, once her desires intersect with those of the merchant, who also is a consumer and sees her as the ultimate bibelot, we see that there are a lot of complex factors that come into play. But DeMille was really using a lot of people from stage who were familiar to the theatrical crowds. He was using them in his films, partly because that was his background and partly as a way to legitimate what he was doing. His greatest coup, of course, was Geraldine Farrar.
Well, of course, one of the points that you make so well in your book is that if today we associate celebrity culture with unquestionably with the movies and now very much with the sports world as well, the celebrity culture as the movies are being created in their modern form now, back in 1915, are really just learning from these surrounding arenas like vaudeville, like Broadway, like opera, that are already celebrity driven.
Right.
And that if you look at the normal newspapers or the trade presses, they're all organized, the stories are organized around the celebrity of these stars. So the movies are learning from antecedent art forms on how to organize themselves in terms of promotion and positioning by regulating and controlling a celebrity system.
That's true. And in fact, that's why the appearance of Geraldine Farrar in DeMille's films is so important, because she was such a celebrity, and she was a high art celebrity. So that when she starred in his films, I mean, in point of fact, if you go back and look at the trade journals, etc., her debut in Carmen was a much more spectacular event than The Cheat. Although in retrospect, scholars look at The Cheat as an important film because of the lighting, the use of shadows, etc., that he totally Bowdlerizes in this film that you're going to show later on, Manslaughter.
Right. Let's shift over. We don't have so much time left. So let's shift over to Sessue Hayakawa and what he accomplishes in the film, but also how he's used in the film. Why is it important to have this character in the film? How does he function in that sense in the film?
Well, I think you could put this film in a double bill with Griffith's Broken Blossoms. Because in that film, Griffith uses Richard Barthelmess as the actor in Yellowface, whereas DeMille actually cast an Asian actor in his film, although his identity has changed from Japanese to Burmese because of the politics of the First World War. But I think that was a very interesting move. He also uses some minor Asian actors in some scenes, so that he doesn't resort to the yellowface or the blackface tradition, which is a very interesting and complex usage in stage, vaudeville, film. All right, and we could go on forever about what that means. And it still pervades entertainment today. But I think that his use of Hayakawa was rather interesting because Jim Card once said to me, the curator who established the collection at Eastman House, was a wonderful person. He once said to me that he thought Hayakawa was such an interesting villain because, he was so understated and because he had his own sense of honor. When she comes to him that second time and asks him to drop the charges, that she would give herself to him now, and he says, "You can't cheat me twice." And Card just loved that scene because he said that Hayakawa was such a complex and interesting person on the screen, as opposed to your cardboard villains with the, with the twirling mustache, etc. The point is, though, that he's still shown in ways that are quite stereotypical. The branding scene, for instance, which is still shocking today. All right, and people who haven't seen the film, they still gasp when they see that scene. So, he's still this barbaric person. The implication is that no matter how much Western veneer he's acquired, he's still a decadent and sinister personality. That's very clear in the beginning of the film, in the credits, in the lighting scene in the credits. But what's interesting about Hayakawa, there's a book on him by Daisuke Miyao now, who's and there is a series of Hayakawa films at the Museum of Modern Art now. But what's interesting about him is that he had a career as an actor, and he was quite splashed. I mean, he made a big splash in the fan magazine pages There were endless stories about him. There was a great deal of fascination about him. He had a very interesting career for a while, but I think that he was limited by the fact that he was an Asian actor.
We're now limited because our time has run out. Hold on. I want to thank you for joining us today. And if you'd like to know more about CUNY TV or about this series, City Cinematheque, the best way to do so is to go to our website, www.cuny.tv. You'll find there a listing of all of our programming, descriptions of what we do, as well as some click-ons so you can communicate with us by email. Once again, please visit for further information, www.cuny.tv. Sumiko, sorry to cut you off, but it's just a mark of how much there is to say and how much longer we could have chatted. I want to thank you for being here today.
Well, it was a pleasure.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to having you back sometime. And I hope that you will join us again as we stroll through the archives of film history here on City Cinematheque. In any case, thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye for now.